Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this lecture against democracy, hosted by the Sir Bernard Crick Centre for the Public Understanding of Politics. My name's Matt Wood, and I'm Deputy Director of the Centre. And I'll be your chair this evening. You can find the Crick Centre at www.crickcentre.org. For tonight's event, you can tweet along using #AgainstDemocracy if you love Twitter as much as I do. Couple of housekeeping points. The fire exits are there, and there. You're almost spoilt for choice. If a fire alarm goes off, please make your way to the St. George's Lecture Theatre, which is just across the road. It's the big church. So now, to introduce our speakers for the evening. Our main lecture will be given by Professor Jason Brennan from the University of Georgetown. We're very happy to have him here over from the United States. Professor Brennan has a prodigious and almost scary publication record. He's published several books, including Markets Without Limits, Compulsory Voting for and Against, Why Not Capitalism, and Libertarianism, What Everyone Needs to Know. Professor Brennan will be presenting the ideas from his latest book with Princeton University Press, Against Democracy. He basically summarized these ideas in a recent article for the New Statesman, where he argued, quote, "We should consider implementing electoral systems in which citizens' votes are weighted by their degree of objective political knowledge." So Professor Brennan's argument is controversial, shall we say, opposing contemporary political assumptions in favour of decision-making by the people, and supporting the likes of the philosopher Plato, who famously argued for rule by enlightened philosophers, and John Stuart Mill, who proposed limiting voting based on education. Following Professor Brennan's talk, we have some quick responses from two esteemed contributors from Sheffield. We have Angie Hobbs, who's Professor of the Public Understanding of Philosophy here at the university, and she's published on a number of these issues, including on Plato. And secondly, I'm delighted to welcome Natalie Bennett, who many of you may know, is the Green Party candidate for the Sheffield Central seat and former leader of the party from 2012 up to 2016. She's going to give us a view more from the practical side of politics and democracy. So Angie and Natalie are going to respond probably for about 10 minutes each, after Jason's talks for about 40 minutes. And then we'll open up for a general audience discussion of these ideas, these controversial ideas, and aim to finish by about 7:30 p.m. tonight. There's also discounted books available if you really feel excited by this debate and want to learn more. So if I could ask you all to give a hand for Professor Brennan, our speaker.
So thank you very much for having me here. It's a pleasure to come here to Sheffield. Incidentally, I'm a huge Def Leppard fan, and this is the home base. So for me, this town serves the sort of role that Liverpool plays for many other people. They took me by, apparently, the pub where they got it all started, but yes, unfortunately did not run into them on here. But thank you very much. So I have this book provocatively titled Against Democracy. What is the argument? Well, just to kind of simplify everything, just imagine for the sake of argument, I came with me a copy of War and Peace, which is a very good book, and I hope you read it at some point. But then I could ask, would any of you consider reading War and Peace tonight? All 1,200 pages tonight? Probably not, even though it's a good book. On the other hand, what if I told you it's not a regular copy of War and Peace, rather it's a special modified copy of War and Peace, where somewhere hidden in the text I've included instructions for where I've left £1 million buried somewhere on the University of Sheffield's campus. Right? You'll have to read the book to find it because I've very carefully hidden it. Would you read the book then? Yeah, probably. What if, on the other hand, I said, no, I haven't hidden the instructions for finding the £1 million in this particular book. Rather, I put it in the multi-million book library that you have here, and it's in one of those books. Would you go to the library and then go search for the text? No, because the chances of you finding it are quite low. Most likely you spend your entire life reading these books and never actually find the information that you wanted. Right? And this basically explains kind of simply what's going on in a modern democracy. There's a certain sort of incentive problem that voters face, and this explains why they're often defective. It's not because they're bad, it's not because they're stupid, it's not because they're mean or evil, but rather because they face some bad incentives. All right, so when we ask whose fault is it that we have subpar government, who's sort of to blame for this? There are lots of people to blame. The corporations, various sorts of unions, corrupt government ministers and others who are looking for their own interests, rather than other people's interests. And it's true that all of those people should be blamed, but when we're putting on our fingers, we should be one of these. Because at the end of the day, democracy does actually work. It works in the sense that what the median voter tends to want tends to happen. Politicians do, in fact, cater to voter preferences. Not perfectly, not overnight. There's a lot of intervening forces that reduce the power of voters, but nevertheless, what voters want does tend to happen. We can demonstrate this empirically and in fact have. But what if the median voter doesn't know what he or she is talking about? So, for example, many votes are about economic matters, about how does the economy actually work. Well, what if the median voter would fail Econ 101, which in fact he would. In fact, today is the 243rd anniversary of the publication of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. And we know, in that book, he was arguing against an economic philosophy he called mercantilism. We know through polls that most voters in the US and in the UK are mercantilists. They still believe the thing that was refuted that long ago. What if the median voter is worried about crime but doesn't understand criminology, which they don't, or don't even know the crime statistics? Are they likely to get their votes right? Well, probably not. So that's the worry. Now, I think voting is an ethical issue. Sometimes people say things like, what business is of yours how other people vote? And my response is, well, they make it my business. I'd love it if they could just vote on whatever they want and it had no effect on me. I wouldn't care at all. In the same way that, if you decide to eat food that I don't like, it has no effect on me, so I'm, of course, not going to complain about that. But how we vote matters. When we vote, we're not just voting for ourselves, we're imposing our will upon other people, upon people who voted the other way, upon people who are not allowed to vote but are affected by those decisions, foreigners, residents from other countries are living here, and so on. So our votes affect others. It is an ethical issue. It's a question of justice, unlike, say, your decision about what to listen to for music, which, it's just up to you. Okay, so I have here a picture of my in-laws. I call them Grand and Pop-Pop, which is what my children call them. They're wonderful people. They're better people than I am. They're really quite virtuous overall. They volunteer at their church every week, they give away food to the needy and the hungry, they donate a pretty significant portion of their income to help other people. But when it comes to politics, suddenly they become much worse people. And when they get involved in politics, start thinking about politics, they get incredibly angry, they can't stand to listen to sort of alternative points of views. They might storm into the bedroom. My mother-in-law in particular likes to watch a TV show by a newscaster in the U.S. I shouldn't really call him a newscaster, it's too laudatory of a term. A person in the U.S. named Bill O'Reilly, just to get angry at him. And she frequently will throw coat hangers at the screen and so on. What's happening here? Well, unfortunately, it turns out empirically the stuff that happens to them happens to most people. When we get involved in politics, we often become more corrupt and angry. So the great political philosopher, the great philosopher, early feminist thinker, great economist, John Stuart Mill, one of my favorite people ever, wrote a good book called Considerations on Representative Government. In it, he had a hypothesis. He hypothesized that if we just get people to get involved in politics, this will enlighten and ennoble them. Getting, say, a Manchester factory worker to start caring about politics would be like getting a fish to discover that there's a world outside of the ocean. It'll force you to kind of confront new and interesting ideas. You'll be forced to inform yourself, and it'll make you a better person. It will enlighten and ennoble you. The economist/sociologist Joseph Schumpeter had a different point of view. I never can get his quotation right, but he says something to the effect of, when the average person enters politics, he reasons in a way that he would consider primitive in any other sphere, in a way that he would consider infantile in any other sphere. The thing is, both of these people had empirical hypotheses, but they didn't have the data to back up these claims. In a sense, they were offering a hypothesis. But the good news is, we do have the data. We've been studying voter behavior empirically and rigorously for over 65 years. It started really in the United States with the University of Michigan in a a few other places, and we have lots and lots of data about Americans, and we have also quite a bit of data about other, like Europeans and Canada and elsewhere. And the results are fairly depressing, and unfortunately they tend to vindicate Schumpeter at the expense of Mill. So, what are voters like? Well, there's a lot of variation. For any one of these things, voters often will follow kind of a bell curve. So they vary in, say, how many opinions they have. Some people have an opinion on everything, and some voters have hardly any opinions. They just don't really care and don't really have any point of view. They vary in how consistent their opinions are. There are voters who have a set ideology where they've actually checked to make sure that all of the ideas make sense together. And then there are voters who have ideologies where you can't do both one thing they want and the other because they contradict each other. They vary in how much information they have. To sort of summarize it, this room helps me a lot. If we know from American voters the following is true. We give them a battery of questions of very basic political information, not high-level social scientific knowledge, which is things like, can you estimate the unemployment rate within 5 percentage points? Do you know roughly how much money is spent in either absolute or relative terms on foreign aid? Do you know who your congressperson is, which only 29% of us do? This is what we find. The top 25% of voters get sort of an A- on this. They get about 90% of the questions right. The middle 50% do about equivalent of chance. We give them multiple choice tests because they're easier to score when you're doing 36,000 of these at a time, and they'll get about 25% of them right. So if we have four answers for every question, they get 25% of them right. We don't know whether they know the answer to 25% of those questions or they're just guessing. But the bottom 25% of voters do worse than chance. They actually do worse than random. They do worse than guessing. They're systematically misinformed. So like say in 1996, which is the numbers I have off the top of my head, we say the bottom 25% of American voters, who is more conservative on average, a Republican or a Democrat? They confidently say, oh, the Democrats are more conservative on average. Great, thanks for that. They also vary in how they process information. Some people are sort of dispassionate social scientific thinkers. They sort of want to be proven wrong because it corrects their errors. Other people, when they learn that someone disagrees with them, they get very angry. The political scientist Diana Muntz wrote a book called Hearing the Other Side, one of my favorite books on politics. Maybe you should read it before mine, perhaps. And she did a poll where she would ask people, you know, you're a committed member of one party. Can you explain to me why someone on the other side would have a point of view contrary to yours? Some people answer by saying, that's easy, they're stupid, and they're evil. Those people participate heavily in politics. They vote frequently and often, they give money to causes, and they engage in activism. Others, when she asked them this question, you're a member of a particular party, can you explain to me why someone would vote the other way? You can go, well, I disagree with them, but here is their ideology. And you can articulate in a way that people on the other side would actually find amenable. She found that those people, the ones who can actually articulate alternative points of view, don't vote, don't participate, don't give money to causes. They stay home. So basically, they're the true believers. Now, I don't know if you have a lot of street preachers here in the UK, but we have quite a few in certain parts of the US. And I guess it kind of makes sense. You never see a person who's thumping a Bible saying, this is the word of God, but you know, you should read the Quran too, because... So, finally, they vary in how much they participate. Some people vote a lot, and some people don't. Right? Nevertheless, I think we can divide them into certain conceptual categories for simplification, which will kind of tell us a lot and sort of simplify matters. So if you've read the Lord of the Rings books, or you've watched the Lord of the Rings movies, you've encountered the hobbits. The hobbits don't care about adventure. They don't want to go out into the world. They just kind of want to like sit around, do some farming, have their breakfast and their second breakfast and their levensies and their lunch and smoke their pipes. And they're just not really concerned with the greater outside world. The political analog of this would be really the typical non-voter in a modern democracy. When we actually look at the people who choose not to vote, here's what we find. They're just not very concerned about politics. They also don't know very much about it. They have very low information, and they just don't have very strong opinions. They don't really care much. If you ask them a question on the spot, they'll give you an opinion, but if you ask them 5 minutes later, they'll give you a contrary opinion, just because people don't like to say I don't know when you ask them questions. But they really just don't have a set ideology. They tend to kind of fall in the moderate, not because they're moderate views, not because they're committed to moderate views, but just because that's the easiest kind of thing to have, right? What about sports fans? So here we have soccer hooligans, and I use this to refer to, you know, think about how soccer hooligans are, or other sports fans, really rabid sports fans. They know a lot about their sport. They can process a lot, they know lots of facts. They can tell you about a game that took place, you know, Manchester United versus Surrey in like, you know, 40 years ago. They know that stuff. But think of how they process information. You know, so they see like a referee pull out a yellow card or something like that. If it's their team, they're like, that's unfair. And if it's against the other team, they're like, of course, that was the right thing to do. In the United States, we don't actually care about this sport, but we love the other kind of football, gridiron football. And there's a big controversy with the quarterback Tom Brady, who's accused of deflating footballs. Now, people from the New England area, like me, I'm originally from there, they thought, of course he's innocent, and then everyone else in the country was like, of course he's guilty. We have access to exactly the same information. We're just processing the information in a way that's amenable to our pre-existing point of view. So it turns out like the average voter in a modern democracy is kind of like a sports fan. It turns out they tend to be fans of politics, they participate because they're interested, but they also process information in a very biased way. They have more information, but they're very biased in how they process it. They only look for information, read news magazines and articles, and watch television that pre-confirms their pre-existing point of views. They also tend to be angry at people with whom they disagree, and if you ask them, why do people disagree with you, they'll say because they're stupid and they're evil. Finally, they're what we might call Vulcans. Well, actually, they really aren't. I don't know if there are any Vulcans. I don't even think I'm a Vulcan. What I mean by a Vulcan, if you've watched Star Trek, is that they're supposed to be these perfectly rational beings that process information in a highly rational way and have like no loyalty to their beliefs. If you show a Vulcan that he or she is wrong about something in politics, their reaction would be, oh, thank you for correcting my errors. I appreciate that. I don't know if you've ever had a conversation with somebody that went that way, but that's how they would. So the reason I use them is not because I think there are Vulcans. I'm certainly not saying Vulcans should rule, because I just don't think there are enough of them. But because many times when you look at the arguments philosophers give about how democracy is supposed to work, they're presupposing that we are Vulcans or can be made to reason like them. So for example, you could really understand Schumpeter versus Mill as follows. Mill is saying most people are hobbits, but if we get them to do democracy together, they'll become Vulcans. What Schumpeter is saying is most people are hobbits or hooligans, and if you get them to deliberate together and do more democratic stuff, what will happen is they'll become even more hooliganish. And I think, unfortunately, the evidence vindicates Schumpeter, not Mill. So, what would you actually need to know? I'm going to skip over this part. Let me ask, why is it that people know so little? They do know very, very little. Why is it? It's an incentive problem. It's not a flaw in their character. So if I'm about to cross the street, I look both ways, right? And I think here I'm supposed to go right and then left. I keep messing that up. I look both ways, not because I think traffic is intrinsically interesting. There are, maybe even here, scientists who study traffic patterns and mathematically model them. I'm not one of those people. I don't find information intrinsically interesting, but I consume that information because it's useful to me at that moment. I need to know whether an automobile is coming. Now suppose I look and I see what appears to be a big 18-wheeler, you call them lorries, right? Lorry coming towards me, and a thought occurs to me, that's not actually a truck, that's actually Optimus Prime, my childhood hero from the Transformers, coming to take me on an adventure to fight Megatron. Here I am. I wouldn't dare do that. I wouldn't indulge that fantasy because if I'm wrong, right, I'll be punished by reality for making that mistake in reasoning. So reality will discipline me to be informed about, automobile traffic patterns and be rational in how I process that. And I actually used to be an automobile insurance adjuster, so I can tell you not everybody gets that right either. But nevertheless, I get punished over time for being wrong and I get rewarded for being right, and so I tend to perform a little bit better. But when it comes to politics, that doesn't happen. Unfortunately, the probability that your vote will be decisive in any major election is very small. And when we ask voters, they know that. They're aware of this fact. They'll say, yeah, my vote counts, but they know that the chances of them winning, being the decisive voter in, say, an MP election is kind of like their chances of winning Euro Millions. It's very, very low, and they're aware of that. And they behave accordingly. So if your vote doesn't make much of a difference, think of what that means. It means if you stay home, the same thing will happen. Even if you vote or stay home, the same thing will happen. If you vote for the other side, the same thing will happen. Regardless of whether you vote or how you vote, your vote will not change the outcome. Now, our votes matter a great deal. How we vote makes a huge difference, but how you vote doesn't. How I vote doesn't. How individual voters vote does not. There is a big debate in political science about just how undecisive voters are. So one view, called the Brendan-Lemaskey theorem, different Brendan from Australia, not me, but a friend of mine, says that the chances that your vote will be decisive in a major election are roughly on par with the chances that, like, when I drop this, it will spontaneously quantum tunnel through my hands. A more optimistic view, associated with people like Gelman and Kaplan and researchers in the US, say that, well, in a major election, you might have as high, like, I'll take a presidential election. Like in a major US presidential election, you might have as a high in a 1 in 20 million chance, but only if you come from one of a few swing states. Otherwise, you still have roughly a 1 in a trillion chance of being decisive. Right? So these are not high odds. Now, if actual voters don't know the real numbers, they don't know the theorems, but when we ask them, like, how likely do you think it is that you will be decisive, they do think it's roughly on par with winning Euro Millions. So in short, it's not that people are stupid, it's that they just don't care. And the reason they don't care is because the incentives are wrong. It's not because of a problem with them. So what does this mean about voter behavior? Well, to sort of summarize what voters are like, we could say the following. They are nice, but ignorant and irrational. What I mean by nice is, it turns out, and this is one of the big surprises that I discovered when I started studying this stuff. I had the view that maybe many of you have, which is, oh, everybody votes their pocketbook, except for me, I vote for justice. But everyone else, they're just voting for their own naked self-interest. Turns out we're all right about ourselves and wrong about others. In fact, self-interest is a very weak motivator when it comes to how people vote. In the US, say, like, the rich don't really vote much differently from the poor. The old don't really vote much differently from the young when it comes to, say, our national pension scheme. Right? This doesn't really have much of an effect on people's voting, and it kind of makes sense if you think about it. If you're really a selfish person and all you care about is yourself, it's not worth your while to vote in the first place. You know, to illustrate, I'll give you some real numbers I calculated with the Brendan Lemaszky formula. Imagine it's 2008, and then candidate Obama calls me up and says, Jay, if I win the presidency, I will guarantee that you will get $10 million. I would have a very strong incentive for him to win, but I wouldn't have any incentive to vote for him, because living in Massachusetts at the time, the probability that my vote would have been decisive, and thus the expected utility of my vote would have been 1 times 10 to the negative $2,645, thousands of orders of magnitude less than a penny. In fact, I'm more likely to die in a car crash on the way to the polls than I am to actually be the decisive voter. So if you're selfish, you just probably won't vote. Instead, you'll probably vote to express your fidelity to like your group, to express your fidelity to a worldview, to express your fidelity to a sense of justice. And there's even some empirical evidence of this, because when we do experiments with people and we get them to have a high chance of being decisive, they switch over from being altruistic voters to being selfish voters. But when you have like a less than a 1 in 1,000 chance of being decisive, people tend to vote altruistically. So they're nice, they care, like most people are what we call nationalist sociotrophs. They vote for what they believe is in the national interest. Doesn't mean they're right, but they vote for what they believe will help their country. That said, they don't know very much, and they don't process information in a very good way. They're ignorant and irrational. So with that, 4 basic facts about political knowledge. The average voter knows very little. The typical voter knows very little. The person right in the middle of the knowledge distribution knows very little. But variance is high. Some people know a great deal, some people know nothing, and some people know less than nothing. Some examples of this. I'll give you some American examples, and I'll give you some British examples. So most Americans cannot identify any of their congressional candidates from a list, let alone just off the top of their head. You know, mine lives in my neighborhood, so I see him once in a while, so it's easy for me. But most people cannot do it, right? They just have no idea who their congressperson is. They don't typically even know which party controls our legislature. Like, who was in power last year? We don't know. Basically, Americans know who the president is and not much else. They really don't know much. Any other fact that you might think would be interesting, they probably don't know that. They don't know what's in, say, our First Amendment. In 1964, they asked Americans, like, is Russia, the USSR, is it part of NATO? You know, NATO, that thing that we created to try to fight Russia, is it part of NATO? And it was only about like 25% of people who could get that question right. And this was a couple of years after we almost had a nuclear war with them, right? Also, these surveys overstate knowledge because they're almost always given in the form of a multiple choice test, and when people don't know the answer, they guess. What about the UK? Well, I'll give an example that might be close to home for you, and which is very good for me. It helped me sell a lot of these books, so I really appreciate you doing this for me. Yeah, Trump and Brexit were great for me. Right? In the way that, like, literally it sold out on Amazon, like, after Trump won. I think, like, just to give you a background, before it came out in English, they sold the translation rights for 4 different languages, and now it's been up to 6. For way more money than normal. I think this is just thanks to you guys voting into it. So I really appreciate that. I'll buy a nice car with it. So Ipsos Mori, a polling firm, did a poll of UK voters immediately after the vote. What did they find? Well, they asked them some questions that might be relevant to the vote. So things like, all right, you're worried about immigrants. What % of the UK is made up of immigrants from the EU? Leave voters say 20%. Remain voters say 10%. The truth, 5%. They asked them, how much money in child benefits do UK voters send overseas? Leave voters overestimated it by a factor of 100, stay voters overestimated it by a factor of 40. They asked them questions about how much foreign investment comes from the EU. The truth is about 49% into the UK. I don't remember the exact numbers, but the Leave voters said it was something like 2%, and the Remain voters thought it was higher, like more like 5 or 6%. They asked them the same question about what % of foreign investments coming from China, and the Remain voters vastly overestimated that. And basically, on every single interesting factual question that might have been relevant to that decision, Everyone got it wrong. Most people got it wrong, though, for what it's worth, the Remain voters were closer to the truth than the Leave voters. That doesn't mean that they're correct, but that sure is interesting. All right. So, does information actually change people's policy preferences? If it had no effect, ignorance wouldn't matter. But it turns out it does, and here's how we know that. What we can do is survey people in a very sophisticated way. We can ask them, who are you in terms of like your demographics? Are you white? Are you male? Are you upper middle class? Are you employed? Do you have a bachelor's degree or higher, etc.? We can ask them questions that maybe things about them, their personal characteristics that might affect the way that they vote. We can then ask them what their policy preferences are, like what do you want to have happen? And finally, we can ask them just basic factual questions. Do you know anything? When we get those 3 sets of data, what we can then do is with like second semester postgraduate statistics that a lot of people in this room can probably do, you can then statistically figure out what would happen to the public if they had perfect information, but we kept their demographics exactly the same. We can figure out how does information affect people's policy preferences while controlling for whatever effect demographics or other factors have.